Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for Alphascape version 2.0 Savage, also known as O10S. This is the second Savage raid encounter made available by patch 4.4 in Final Fantasy XIV Prelude and Violet. Since we're coming up on the tail end of the expansion, this may not come as a shock to you, but this boss has quite the fiery disposition, and maintaining ice-cold focus here is your immortal key to victory. My name is MTQ and I'll be your raid guide. Similar to normal mode, players will need to recognize and react to specific boss movement tells that allow players to pre-position for the incoming attacks. On Savage mode, there is one new combo to learn. To recap, if the boss starts with a spin, followed by another spin, players will need to move out of melee range to avoid the point-blank AoE. If the boss spins, but then follows it up with a flip, players will need to move inside his hitbox to avoid the room-wide donut AoE. If the boss begins with a flip, and then follows it up with another flip, players will have to move into the corners to avoid the cross-shaped AoE. The new combo to look out for begins with a flip, followed by a spin. This will cause a massive X-shaped AoE to cover the platform. The only safe zones for this attack are at the edges of the platform on the cardinal points. Since various mechanics will be happening in conjunction with these movement tells, we assign specific safe zones to specific players, especially for the two flip combinations. This ensures that each player will have enough room to handle any overlapping AoE mechanics that may occur at the same time. Let's discuss tail end. This is a very heavy-hitting tank buster that occurs fairly frequently, so you'll need a well-defined cooldown and immunity rotation. First off, the boss will recenter and begin his first movement tell combo. This attack will always be a flip-spin combo, signaling the X-shape AoE is incoming. All players will need to immediately move to their respective safe zones as soon as the second flip animation begins. Getting hit by this attack will deal high damage and place a stacking vulnerability up debuff on you. Next, the boss will spin and then a player will be marked for Morn. All players but the main tank will need to stack together to share that damage. Throw up some cooldowns, shield, and heal through the damage. After the last hit of Morn, the boss will finalize his tell combo with another spin, indicating that the point-blank AoE is incoming. All players must immediately move out of melee range to avoid this. The boss will then target the main tank for another tank buster. In our group, we like to tank swap here to allow us to stretch our tank cooldowns a little bit further before the mechanics keep us from doing so. Next, the boss will spin and then mark up every single player with Earthshakers. To ensure proper spread, we have each player assigned to a cardinal and intercardinal point around the boss. The boss will then either cast another spin or flip. If it's a spin, players need to get out of melee range. If it's a flip, players need to stay inside his hitbox. Regardless of whether you need to go in or out, all players need to ensure they remain spread in their assigned spots, since the Earthshaker damage will be going off at the same time. The next combo begins with a flip. Cooldown through another tank buster, and then 4 players will be marked for the circle thunderstorm markers while the boss either flips or spins. Players will need to run to their assigned corner or cardinal spots to dodge this and also spread the thunderstorm markers to avoid overlap. Time Immemorial will apply 1 of 2 debuffs on both tanks. Before the actual cast goes off, the tanks can see what debuff they will receive by the color of the swirls around them. Yellow will apply death from below, while blue will apply death from above. This debuff limits what each tank can actively tank to either a flying mob or a walking mob. Tanking the wrong thing will cause the enemy auto attacks to apply a doom debuff on the tank, eventually killing them. This debuff will determine which tank will be tanking what in the following phases. Since Midgard is currently flying, if the active tank gets targeted for a death from above, a tank swap is necessary at this time. This is followed by another tank buster. For the next combo, the boss will begin with a spin. Northern Cross will then apply thin ice all over the platform, and players must be very careful to control their movement. The boss will then flip or spin. If he's flipping, players will stay inside his hitbox. If he spins, players will need to slide their characters out of melee range. Immediately after, 2 players will be targeted for ice puddles. These players can slide to a safe spot to drop these off so that the resultant growing puddles don't get in the way of the raid. The boss will then cast Akral, targeting the ground under 2 damage dealers for massive damage. All players will need to make sure they move out of this as quickly as possible. For the next combo, the boss will begin with a spin. Here, all players will be targeted by circle AoE attacks, and I would recommend stacking up to bait these in a controlled manner. As soon as these circle telegraphs appear, the boss will either spin or flip. If he flips, players need to dodge out of these ground circle AoEs while staying inside his hitbox. If he spins, players will need to dodge out of the ground circle AoEs out of melee range. Remember that the ice puddles are still actively growing during this time, so be careful not to step into them as you dodge. 2 more auto attacks will occur before the boss flies away and the add phase begins. The ancient dragon in this phase is a walking dragon, so the tank that was actively tanking the boss with the death from below debuff cannot tank the ancient dragon without dying. Since the boss transfers all of his enmity to the ancient dragon, the tank with death from above must provoke right before the boss disappears or as soon as the ancient dragon spawns. In this phase, a number of immortal keys will spawn around the platform. These will either be tethered to another key or tethered to both a key and the ancient dragon, rendering it immune. Players will have to work their way through these keys, destroying the single tethered keys first until all the keys are destroyed and the ancient dragon becomes vulnerable to damage. The boss is charging up his Aether Gauge during this time, and you have until 100 to destroy the ancient dragon or you will wipe. The dragon itself will cast a spicy frontal cone and an AoE blast. The active tank can pop some cooldowns here as necessary. As the ancient dragon dies, it will cast Dark Wave, a point-blank AoE attack that players should move out of. It will also drop a circle on the ground that will apply the Arcane Bulwark buff on anyone that steps inside of it. This bulwark will transfer to a player if they are too close, rendering the previous player immune to its effects. The bulwark will be used to negate the damage of certain lethal mechanics in the upcoming phase, so make sure that it's not prematurely passed around. In our group, we assign one player to grab it every time. At this time, the boss will cast Protostar and transition into the next phase. The group will need to cooldown, shield, and heal through that damage. We stack in the center and wait for Midgardsummer to appear somewhere on the edge. He will soon dive bomb across the half of the platform in a straight line in front of him. At the same time, ground AoE circles will form under every player, and certain players will be marked for incoming thunderstorm AoEs. Stacking in the center allows us to bait the first set of AoE circles in an organized manner. Players can then dodge to the safe side of the platform while also spreading out their thunder markers to avoid overlap. Once these AoEs resolve, everyone returns to the center and waits for another set of AoEs and one more boss dive bomb to manage. Keep in mind that while dodging all of this, players will need to be very careful not to get too close to the player assigned to carry the bulwark. After the second dive bomb set completes, the boss will return to the platform. This time, he is walking on the ground. He will immediately cast Time Immemorial, reapplying the debuffs on the tanks. Remember that if the active tank gets death from below, a tank swap will be necessary. At this point, we have the player with the bulwark position themselves on the boss's side. Next, a random player will be targeted with this orange marker. This player will need to run to the off tank and take the bulwark from them. This marker indicates that they will be targeted by a massive and incredibly lethal Crimson Breath. The only way to survive this mechanic is to grab the Arcane Bulwark and take the breath alone on the side of the boss. 4 players will be targeted for this Crimson Breath in a row, and each one will need to run to the Arcane Bulwark player to take the buff, while the previous player runs back to safety since they are left defenseless. After 4 hits of Crimson Breath, the Arcane Bulwark will turn into a Crumbling Bulwark, and its powers of immunity will become limited. The boss will then summon 3 sets of orbs diagonally across the platform. These will first spawn in the center, then a corner, and finally the opposite corner. For those of you who remember the Nidhogg encounter, this is the exact same mechanic. Each orb in each set will explode in massive line AoEs in the order that they spawned in. At the same time, a player will be tethered to the boss, indicating that they will be the target for the incoming Hot Tail, which will deal highly lethal damage in a straight line across the platform from the boss to the tethered player. Since this player can move around, they can essentially control where Hot Tail is cast. You'll use this to your advantage to ensure the safety of the rest of the raid. The last player to receive the Arcane Bulwark, which is now a Crumbling Bulwark, will be in charge of the Hot Tail tether. Without the Crumbling Bulwark, the tethered player will die. Let's take this part slow. The 3 sets of orbs will appear on the platform. The group will need to move to the corner of the last set of orbs to spawn and stack together to bait the incoming Horrid Roar AoE circles. As you position for this, the Crumbling Bulwark player can grab the tether and move away from the group while still being in the safe corner. Horrid Roar AoEs will come out and players will need to dodge them while still staying within the safety of that corner while the center orbs explode. Once those center orbs explode, players can move to position themselves in the safe spot out of the way of the last corner orb explosions. The Hot Tail tether player will then position themselves in a way that keeps Hot Tail from cleaving the group. The damage from Hot Tail will also remove the last of the bulwark on the affected player. There are a number of ways to do this, with varying levels of difficulty and uptime management, so do what works best for your group. At this point, Midgardsummer will fly away and appear somewhere on the edge again for another dive bomb. At the same time, Exa players will begin to spawn on one of the edges and players will be targeted for the ground circle AoEs. To handle this, players must first move out of the AoE circles to the safe side of the platform and identify where the exaflares are coming from. Staying together here and dipping behind moving exaflares is an easy way to handle this. The boss will reappear for a second dive bomb, and more AoE circles will appear under players. Dodge these in the same manner. Finally, the boss will return to the platform, and you'll notice that he's back to flying. Make sure the tank with death from below is actively tanking during this time. He'll start off with another tail-end tank buster. Don't forget those cooldowns. Next, a player will be targeted for Akmorn, and the group will again stack to share that damage. Immediately after, all players will be targeted for ground circle AoEs and have thunderstorm marks above their head. Players will need to dodge out of the circle AoEs and spread out their thunders to avoid overlap. Here, the boss will start another combo with a flip. Another tank buster will target the main tank, and then 4 players will be marked for thunderstorm while the boss either spins or flips. Dodge to your assigned safe zone to avoid this and easily spread out those thunders. Next up, another time Immemorial will reapply the debuffs on the tanks. If the active tank gets targeted for death from above, make sure you tank swap. Next up, 2 players will be marked for ice puddles, and a round of exaflares will spawn on one of the edges. In our group, we prefer that the ice puddle players drop their ice puddles on the edge opposite to the exaflare spawn. The group will then move to the edge that is spawning the exaflares and dip in behind one of the moving exaflares. A player will be targeted for Akmorn here, and you want to stack in a guaranteed safe spot to share all of that damage. Eventually, the boss will return to the center and start another combo with a flip. Northern Cross will render the platform slippery again, so players will need to be ready to control their movement. 4 players will be targeted for thunderstorm again, while the boss either flips or spins. Have players slide out to their appropriate safe spots to easily avoid overlapping thunders. Another set of horrid roar circle AoEs will appear under the players before the platform returns to normal. Make sure you slide out of these as necessary. Next up, Akral will target the ground under damage dealers again. Move out of these to reduce damage. Another tank buster, and then the boss begins another combo with a spin. Yet another tank buster to cool down through, and all players will be marked up for Earthshakers while the boss either spins or flips. Make sure to either move in or out while maintaining your assigned Earthshaker position to avoid overlap. Time Immemorial will again reapply the tank debuffs, and a tank swap may be necessary. Next up, 2 players will be marked for ice puddles, and another round of exaflares will begin to spawn on one of the edges. The group will again move to where the exaflares are spawning and dip in together behind one of the moving ones in preparation for another Akmorn. Stack up to share that damage. This last combo leads into the Enrage with an Akmorn that does an insane amount of damage. You may be able to survive for a little longer with tons of mitigation and healing, but eventually he will cast a hard Enrage and you will die. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Up next, we'll head into Alphascape version 3.0 Savage. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.